So we're really privileged today to welcome Dr. Wayne Coblentz as one of our speakers for this session. Dr. Coblentz has spent many years working at the USDA ARS research station in Madison, Wisconsin, and has worked on some really innovative stuff on different forage systems in the north central US. So Dr. Coblentz, take it away.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. Discuss this with you. Most of the work here that I'm going to describe was done in central Wisconsin, primarily at the Marshfield research station, although that's not necessarily true of all of it. So I will give you that little tidbit up front. The first thing that I think we need to talk about a little bit is vernalization and how that applies to managing cereal grain forages. And that would include in the north central part of the United States. And that's a cold treatment required by certain plant species in order for them to properly flower. There can be an absolute requirement for this, such as winter wheat, barley, or rye, or no requirement, which would be true for a true spring wheat or spring barley. Also, vernalization also often interacts with photoperiod. From a management perspective, for some species, though, it's a bit more complicated than that. For instance, oat has no requirement for vernalization, but typically does not produce seed with a late summer planting date. Triticale, for instance, technically, most varieties in the United States are facultative, which means they have no requirement for vernalization, but some are in fact obligatory, which means that vernalization is required. What this really means in terms of management is if you're interested in using Triticale, if you plant it too early in the late summer or fall, many varieties will joint and actually elongate, although they tend to be very slow to do that. And it's potential then that they may not survive the winter. Ideally, the goal should be to manipulate these different physiological traits to a productive advantage for each producer, and that's going to be dependent on their production goals. Before we get into a more in-depth discussion here, I wanted to take just a minute and compare the species a little bit for anyone that may not be familiar. What I've plotted up here, and this was some work that I did many years ago at the University of Arkansas. I've plotted the growth stage of 3 different species, oat, wheat, and rye, as a function of various dates for utilization in the spring. Now, in the South, oat is actually planted in the fall, and it's highly susceptible to freeze out, but we'll ignore that for the time being. That wouldn't be true in the north central part of the United States. The key for the growth stage, and that'll be consistent throughout all these slides, is in your lower right-hand corner here. You'll notice that when you get to this key point of utilization, in many cases, the growth stage for rye is going to be well ahead of wheat and oat. And this is a difference of the beginning of flowering compared to the very beginning of boot within this particular range. So that's quite a large range in terms of actual physiological development. If you look at plant height, you'll notice that at that same date, there's a huge difference in the height of these plants. And one of the characteristics of many rye cultivars is they tend to be much taller growing than the other cereal species. If you look at the concentration of structural fiber represented here as NDF, you'll see at these time points that you might be interested in utilizing them, particularly as a harvest of silage, or in the South, maybe even hay. The NDF concentration is much higher on these dates, and that's linked to the more rapid development as well as the taller growth habit. If you look at the concentration of acid detergent lignin, which is sort of like the rebar that holds the structural fiber together and helps hold plants up erect, you'll see that that concentration is much higher on these dates than it is for the other species. And if you take these plants out to near maturity, what you'll also observe is that the proportion of the total dry matter in rye cultivars associated with the head itself is typically less than it is for other cereal species. So when you manage these, you need to keep this kind of stuff in mind. There are advantages to rye. It matures more rapidly. You can utilize it as silage or whatever means you want to utilize it more quickly. At the same time, the quality characteristics tend to deteriorate much more rapidly. My dad always said that I don't care if it's a hurricane, if you're harvesting rye and it hits boot stage, you better be out there mowing it. And my dad did know something about hurricanes. I grew up in Maryland, so that was not an uncommon event. Anyway, he was right about that. The quality does deteriorate much faster for rye typically than it does for other cereal species. Many years ago at the University of Minnesota, Jerry Chermy did some work with a variety of cereal grain species, and this is kind of informative, and it sets a stage, I think, for some of the slides that follow, and it introduces the concept of dilution. What he did here was, and I've plotted in the upper left-hand corner, the concentration of acid detergent lignin for various tissue types within these cereal grain forages as a function of maturity. And as you would expect, as most plants do, as they become more and more mature, the concentration of lignin increases in stem, sheath, and the blade, but not in the inflorescence. And that is the result of the beginning of grain fill. And when you start to think about the quality of a plant on a whole plant basis, this is a rather consistent thing that has to be negotiated, because the relative proportions of these tissue types will influence what effect maturity has on things like overall dry matter digestibility. And for these same plants described up here, if you look at dry matter digestion, this is done in vitro for these tissue types, you will notice that they decline, as you would expect with maturity for all these tissue types except the inflorescence. And how much that increases is a subject of how much head, how much grain fill is associated with the development of the plant. As I showed you in the previous slide, for something like rye, that head weight may be much lower than it is for wheat or oat or barley. So the relative proportions of these tissue types have a large impact on the quality on a whole plant basis. Okay. For this discussion, what I really want to talk about here are about 4 different scenarios for using cereal grain forages in livestock systems. The first one, I'm not going to spend very much time on it because it really doesn't apply much to the north central part of the country. But for lack of a better way of putting it, I'm going to call it Oklahoma wheat pasture. Most people are familiar with that. Weaned cattle in the fall are placed on vegetative, usually wheat, until they are backgrounded to the point that they can go to a finishing lot. This has proven to be very effective. There's also a dual purpose opportunity there where if cattle are removed soon enough, they can go ahead and harvest a grain crop there. The second scenario is a fall establishment of a cereal grain, and I'll use as an example Triticale. It could also be barley or wheat or rye. A third scenario is very similar. This would be a spring establishment of something like oat. It also could be a spring wheat or a spring barley, followed by a summer harvest. And then the last one that I want to discuss, which we spent a lot of time on, which is a little bit different and may or may not be something folks listening have heard or heard discussed very much, is a summer establishment of a cereal grain. And most of our work has been with oat. It also can include spring barley and spring wheat, something that does not require vernalization. And then that forage growth is utilized before winter, which is a different approach. So we'll talk about those as we go through. I've already said a little bit about this dual purpose wheat scenario. I use Oklahoma. That's certainly not limited to Oklahoma. It's used in some other states in that part of the world as well. I don't think we need to dwell anymore on that for this presentation. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about systems 2 and 3 together because they're really similar in some respects in that the plants mature and would be available for harvest in the summer months, and they would develop in the spring and summer months. So we'll kind of group them together. For purposes of this discussion, most of the work is with Triticale. We've done quite a bit of work with Triticale in central Wisconsin. And to set this up, the management aspects of this are a little bit complex in some ways, even if it would not seem so. The growing season in central Wisconsin is fairly short. And what we find with Triticale planted in the fall is that it's going to hit boot stage typically the week of Memorial Day. And boot stage is often referred to or suspected or recommended as probably the best growth stage for harvest for a lactating dairy cow type of application. Another one that's often mentioned, if you consult literature and recommendations down through the years, many people have suggested a soft dough stage of growth. However, in central Wisconsin, this occurs about the 4th of July. With a harvest at Memorial Day, you still have the opportunity for a double crop of corn, principally for silage, or potentially soybeans, or there are some other options. By the time you get to the 4th of July, you've lost most of that. And maybe a summer annual would be about the only thing that you would have available to you at that time. Or you could just allow to lay fallow and use it to accept manure for a short period of time and then go back to something in the fall. So your options are very restricted by the time you get to the 4th of July in our environment in central Wisconsin. The other thing that's important to note here is there's quite a yield drag associated with this early harvest date. About a 70% reduction for these 2 years between the 4th of July and Memorial Day. This is a better quality forage for a lactating cow. It provides you with an opportunity for a double crop. However, you're going to take quite a yield hit. There was a difference in yield between the 2 years. This was an excellent spring for cereal grain growth. In this particular year, we had a poor year, largely because of some flooding that occurred during the early spring. And that restricted the growth that we got in those forages quite a bit. Okay, if you want to look at the quality characteristics of these Triticale forages, and I should probably emphasize that I would expect that many of these trends are going to be similar, or the concepts will be similar if you're talking about wheat or barley or even rye to some degree. If you look at the concentration of NDF as a function of growth stage, you'll notice as these plants mature, like most plants, the structural fiber concentration in those plants is going to increase. But when you get out here to these later stages of development in which you're partitioning carbohydrate into the filling grain head, you'll notice that the concentration of NDF decreases. Now, you're not mobilizing NDF. Once it's NDF, it's going to stay in structural fiber. What you're actually doing here is diluting the amount of structural fiber with the partitioning of additional carbohydrate into the filling grain head. If, for instance, you would look at acid detergent lignin, you see that this relationship is somewhat similar, but a little less clear. You get a plateau out here. Again, that's associated with dilution. If you look at the digestibility of dry matter, the rate, you get a nice quadratic response as a function of growth stage. And if you look at in vitro dry matter disappearance at 30 and 48-hour incubations, you'll notice that you get a predictable decline with maturation, except that you do get an uptick in the digestibility of dry matter in this particular case, as that plant starts to partition non-structural carbohydrate into that filling grain head. Now, this, of course, has some implications for the energy content of the forages as well, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. Now, in contrast to that, if you were to look at the effects of growth stage on NDF digestibility and exclude the non-fiber portions of the plant, you'll notice that for these same plants with a 24, 30, and 48-hour incubation, the relationship with growth stage is essentially linear, at least for all practical purposes. That's technically, these are not strictly linear, but for practical purposes, they really are. You do not see an uptick gap here because the digestibility of NDF is not really associated with partitioning of non-structural carbohydrate into the grain head. So dry matter digestibility and energy density usually increase at the soft dose stage of growth. But from a practical standpoint, this is completely independent of NDF digestibility and solely a function of grain fill. So if you take that message home with you, I think that's important. To look at this another way, this is a different sample set. And again, we have the same key for growth stage, which I've included here on the graphic. If you look at 48-hour digestibility of fiber as a function of growth stage, again, you get this mostly linear decline as a function of growth stage, which is very similar to what I showed you in the previous slide. However, if you change that up just a little bit and you plot fiber digestibility against the amount or the concentration of fiber in the plant, you'll see that there's a very predictable linear decline, which is associated with maturation and plant development, up to a point where these plants start to partition again non-structural carbohydrate into that grain head. And then these forages wander off the reservation, so to speak. And the reason for that is fairly obvious. Again, this is a dilution effect in that the filling grain head has suppressed the concentration of NDF within these plants, and it's shifted them back to the left. And therefore, you have this unusual relationship here. The same thing also applies with 80 for concentrations of acid detergent lignin. They are also diluted, although it's a little bit less obvious than it is for NDF. Now, in terms of management, you might wonder, okay, how does all this affect how I should target my harvest with the livestock class that I'm trying to feed? In this simple graphic here, I have the concentration of NDF represented by the blue bars at these various harvest stages, and energy, in this case calculated as TDN, as a function of the same growth stages, and they're represented by the red bars. And you'll notice, as we've showed before, that the NDF concentration increases with maturity up to the point of anthesis or flowering, and then it declines with grain fill. Conversely, the concentration of energy remains high, and then it declines with maturity, but you do see somewhat of an increase in this particular case at the soft dose stage of growth. So for instance, for a 600-pound dairy heifer, a boot stage harvest would meet their energy requirement. That would also probably be the optimum growth stage for harvest for a lactating cow. If you wanted to harvest back here, you would have a higher energy content, but the yields would be so low as to be pointless. If you want, for instance, to feed a pregnant dairy heifer, which has a much lower energy requirement, you might want to target a more advanced growth stage. such as adanthesis, which is typically the minimum. That would also have an advantage of a much better yield, but it would also have the limitation of a delayed harvest date. So those are all factors that you need to weigh into management decisions. The last thing I want to touch on with respect to this scenario is if you have been in tune with academia or the consultant sphere, you may be aware that there's been some discussion over the last 5, 6, 7 years about 2 and 3 pool models for fiber digestion. And I don't want to get too deep into this, but basically up to now, most fiber digestion work has been based on the principle that you have 2 pools. It's either digestible or it's not digestible. This newer concept or additional concept is that there are actually 3 pools. There is a fast pool of digestion, a slow pool of digestion, and an indigestible portion. What I've plotted up at the top here are the relative proportions as a percent of total NDF of these 3 pools, where the black dots represent the fast pool, which you see declines with growth stage, which you might expect. The indigestible pool increases as a function of growth stage, and that's not surprising either. And then the slow pool shows a relatively slow increase as a function of growth stage. What's quite interesting about this is that the fast pool, the rate of digestion decreases in a quadratic fashion as a function of growth stage, but the slow pool has no relationship to growth stage, at least in this particular study, which we found quite interesting. That's really all I want to say about that, but I thought I would at least mention it. So the key management decision for Triticale, and I think this would also apply to winter wheat or barley or rye that's harvested in the spring, is do you want to maximize yield or nutritive value, fiber digestibility, the consequence of a considerable yield loss by an earlier harvest, and urgency related to a double cropping need for corn or beans or whatever your situation is, which is most important, and how do you weigh that to your own advantage? So that's the take-home complexity in terms of management. Now, I want to spend a considerable amount of time here at the end on the system that we have been working on in central Wisconsin for many, many years. And that involves a late summer planting of these cereal forages and then fall harvest and utilization before winter. And I've used the word oat here. It wouldn't necessarily have to be strictly limited to oat. We've done some work that would suggest that a true spring barley, spring wheat would perform well with the same scenario. The context for this within Wisconsin anyway is twofold. One, what are my options for extending the grazing season? The second one would be, when we get these questions commonly, I'm going to be short on forage. It's the middle of July. What is my best option to provide me with forage for the winter in a situation where I'm in a real bind in terms of inventory? So that was the context in which we've operated primarily in Wisconsin. I like to take a minute whenever I give this presentation and back up and kind of give you a little bit of background about how I got started in this. For many years, or for a number of years, I was on the faculty at the University of Arkansas, and this is very much a beef-oriented state. And there's a lot of calves that are weaned in Arkansas, particularly in the fall. And a great many of them have historically wound up in Oklahoma on wheat pasture, where they're backgrounded and then sent on to a feedlot. And of course, this is a tremendous economic advantage for the state of Oklahoma, but it doesn't necessarily help the folks in Arkansas the way you might like if you're working for the state of Arkansas. So the first thought would be, okay, why can't we implement the same system they have in Oklahoma here in Arkansas? Well, there's a couple reasons why that didn't necessarily work very well. One is in Oklahoma, livestock production and grain production are integrated throughout the state. And in Arkansas, for all practical purposes, they're completely segregated. All the cattle are in the northern part of the state, in the southern Ozarks, or down the western part of the state in the Ouachita Mountains. All the grain production is over here in the Mississippi River Delta. So this made this a little more complex than it might appear on the surface. But anyway, after several years of various attempts to find a production system that might be useful, I finally teamed up with the cereal grain breeder, Dr. Bacon, and I had a graduate student, and we just decided at that time, let's forget spring yield, let's forget winter survivability. What we really need is a highly nutritious forage to put wean cattle on in the fall. Anything will grow down there in the spring. Let's not even worry about the spring. We're going to just worry about the fall. So Dr. Bacon came up with a smorgasbord of cereal grain varieties or cultivars from different breeding programs throughout the United States. And we threw them out there with the primary response variable being the availability of forage in the fall. And what I've put up here are three different entries in that. Horizon fall oat. Now, oat does not have a vernalization requirement, but this was from a southern breeding program from the Florida program. Blaze oat, which is from Illinois. And then this is one of Dr. Bacon's soft red winter wheat varieties. You'll notice that the oat varieties both elongated. If you can tell from the photographs, they're much taller in height compared to the wheat, which is entirely vegetative. These have elongated. And what we found is that if you're interested in fall forage across any number of utilization dates, anything that elongates is going to maintain about a 2-to-1 advantage in dry matter yield compared to a forage that does not elongate. So that was encouraging. Now, that does not come without a cost. The most obvious limitation associated with that is that if you utilize these oat varieties, in this case in the fall, particularly after they've jointed and elongated, there's absolutely no potential for regrowth whatsoever. It is strictly a one-time usage stockpile type of forage. If you contrast that with a typical winter wheat, you'll notice that even with the same utilization dates, you have very healthy plants by the 15th of February in that environment. So the early conclusions were in Arkansas, forages that elongate will out-yield those that remain vegetative by about a 2-to-1 ratio before winter. Oat will joint and elongate during late fall, but there's very little regrowth potential after joining. From a management perspective, however, this can be viewed as positive, negative, or both, depending on what your production goals are. And we could discuss that in more detail if anyone is so inclined to ask about it. Depending on the weather, growth responses can be highly variable. And these were all done without the benefit of any type of irrigation. So upon moving to Wisconsin, I had a conversation with Dan Understander at that time. He's now retired, but at that time he was the extension forage specialist for Wisconsin, and he actually encouraged me to continue this. Now the focus is a little bit different, but he thought there was a place for this in the forage toolbox, so to speak. So ideally in Wisconsin, it would be desirable to double crop or use a cereal grain forage after harvesting corn silage. And this is very possible further south, such as in the mid-Atlantic. But in Wisconsin, that's not really possible. It's too far north. The growing season is too short if you want to harvest additional fall forage after removing corn silage. Now, you can plant a winter annual cereal that will not elongate, but if you want to harvest something in the fall, that's not really possible with this short growing season. In Wisconsin, a fall crop of cereal grain forage, in this case oat, will need to follow a summer harvest of cereals as silage or grain. Another option for establishment is to eliminate old or stale stands of alfalfa early, like in late July or early August, essentially foregoing the last cutting, and then plant oat. And this would be accomplished by spraying them out, usually applying a generous application of dairy slurry and then drilling them into this alfalfa sod. Either way, regardless of how you establish these, an opportunity exists for summer manure distribution. And I don't want to gloss over that. Actually, that's one of the major benefits of using this kind of a system in some way, is that it doesn't open up a really good window or opportunity to distribute manure that's independent of corn production. And as many people know, it can be wet in the spring, it can be wet in the fall, it can be wet both times. And this is a real problem if your entire distribution for manure is linked closely to corn silage production. So this opens up another opportunity when you may actually have more time to deal with it as well. The first study that we did in Wisconsin was at Prairie du Sac. And in this particular experiment, we used a similar format to the one that we used in Arkansas, a smorgasbord of entries that included 2 wheat varieties or cultivars and 4 oat cultivars. And across 3 utilization dates, the first thing we found was that this relationship, this 2-to-1 relationship between anything that elongates, which would have been the oat cultivars compared to the wheat, was maintained. So you get about twice the yield with anything that elongates compared to something that does not. The other thing that we found that was quite interesting, and it is a little bit of a complexity in terms of management. These 4 fall oat cultivars, Ogle, Drumlin, Vista, and Forage Plus, as you proceed across this gradient to the right, their maturation rate slows pretty considerably. One of the things about these forage oat types, whether it was an intentionally selected for or unintentionally selected for, is that they tend to mature much more slowly than a lot of grain types. So there's a gradient as you move from left to right in terms of maturation rate, which is reflected down here in this table at the bottom in terms of the maturity level at harvest across 2 years. But what you will notice is that the rapidly maturing grain types tended to out-yield the forage type and some of these more slowly developing grain types. And this is exactly backwards from what you would normally expect. And that caused us to scratch our head a little bit. But I think what happens here is that these forage types or a slow developing grain type, they simply run out of time. If you don't plant them early enough, their slow maturation rate becomes a liability. And we'll show you that as we move on here. But before we do that, there's some other interesting things that we noticed in this first experiment. One of which is when we did some analysis, we found that the lignin concentration in these forages was extremely low. Now, if you were to go to the NRC 2001 publication for dairy, you will find in the table, excuse me, that the lignin concentration of an headed oat plant should be about 10% of the NDF. which is going to be about 6% of the total dry matter. And I've drawn a black line there to illustrate that. The concentration in lignin in these harvested oat forages in the fall, is far lower than that. And in some cases, it's down less than 20% of what you might expect. And so that has some interesting applications in terms of dairy nutrition. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words. And just to illustrate the low concentration of lignin in these forages, one thing that sometimes happens in Wisconsin, in central Wisconsin particularly, is that you get a fairly significant wet, heavy snowfall in late October. And we were running a grazing trial at the time this picture was taken. And these heifers were getting a daily allocation based on moving a lead wire, as you see in the lower photograph there. And the fact that these oat forages were completely lodged didn't bother them very much. But if you wanted to harvest that and put it in the silo, it would be a real problem. So I think that illustration makes it pretty clear that the lignin concentration in these forages is quite low. Now, if you would go on and look at the fiber digestibility as a function of lignin for forages like this, you'll notice that with these really low lignin concentrations, you get very, very high fiber digestibility. But by the time you get out here at this 6% level, which is about 10% of the NDF in a headed oat plant, you can see that that has deteriorated to a very low level. So you get a very high fiber digestibility in these plants grown in the fall because they grow when it's cool. And one of the factors affecting lignification is temperature. So in a cool and growing environment, you're going to have less lignin. In addition to that, there's all sorts of photoperiod and maturation abnormalities compared to the normal situation with these oat plants, which probably contribute to the high level of fiber digestibility. The management question is, which cultivar do I plant and when? And we followed that up with a 3-year experiment in Marshfield, which is right in the center of Wisconsin. And in this particular study, we had 3 oat cultivars: the Ogle, which is a rapidly developing grain type; Vista is a slow developing grain type; Forage Plus is a true forage type. And we planted those on the 15th of July, August the 1st, and August the 15th. And what we found was that with these really early dates, the predictable advantage for yield for the forage type and even the slower maturing grain type, it occurs as you would expect. And even on about August the 1st in the central part of Wisconsin, that would be the same you would expect. However, when you get out to the 15th of August, you're starting to run out of time. And in that case, you don't see that effect. Now, this relationship here, based on other work that I've done, is a little bit of an abnormality. Normally, you would expect with this late planting date, that relationship to actually show a greater yield for the rapidly maturing grain type. The other issue that you deal with in this situation or this scenario is not only on the front end in terms of establishment, but also is affected by the back end. How early does winter come? And that plays into this as well. One of the things that was very interesting about these plants, which I haven't talked about yet, is the way these plants that are grown in the fall in this manner accumulate sugar. And for the July 15th planting date, you'll notice that the rapidly maturing grain type has a decrease in water-soluble carbohydrates or sugar as a function of utilization date. The same thing occurs for the slower maturing grain type. But for the forage type, you start to see a little bit of a difference here, particularly for this 1st of November harvest date. And what that is associated with is when even though these plants will die, they undergo some of the same type of survival mechanisms that a true winter forage would use to survive the winter. And by that, I mean they will accumulate solutes within the cells. And one of the principal solutes they accumulate is sugar. And this tends to occur in our experience up through boot stage. But once they get a lot beyond boot stage, they don't tend to do that. They just turn color and essentially die. So this is reflective of the slower maturation in Forage Plus, even with this really early planting date. By the time you get to an August 1st planting date, you'll see that the ogle really is not able to take advantage of this because it's too mature. You start to see this effect. These Vista plants have been zapped by frost several times and they're starting to accumulate sugar, but you get a very dramatic effect with the Forage Plus, which is of course not as mature as the other two. By the time you get out to the late planting date, all of these entries are able to accumulate these concentrations of sugar in response to frost events. To discuss this concept of dilution, which I've mentioned before, it also applies with this accumulation of water-soluble carbohydrates. And what I'm showing here are two different pictures. And I think most anyone listening to this presentation, if they were going to choose one for their cattle to graze on, if they wanted to maximize weight gain and so forth, would immediately gravitate to this one on the right, which is green, rapidly growing, and it's probably jointed, but it's a very immature plant. Excuse me. The one on the left is elongated. It's been damaged by frost a number of times. It's discolored and so forth. Now, we did some gas production work with this, which I'm not really going to dwell on, but what I really want you to take a look at is this comparison of different nutritive indices for these two forages. They both were planted on the same date, August the 1st. The green one was harvested on 15th of September. The discolored one much later than that. And what I will tell you actually is that both of those forages are the same plot. They're different pictures of the same thing. You'll notice, however, that the NDF concentration and that of most all the fiber components is almost identical. The immature forage has a much greater percentage of crude protein compared to the more mature discolored forage. However, if you look at the concentration of sugar, you'll see that it's about 6 times as high for this discolored forage as it is for the immature forage. One other thing that's very consistent is that these immature cereal grains tend to have very high concentrations of ash, which if you're calculating energy, detracts from the end estimate of energy because ash does not have any energy associated with it. But anyway, at the end of the day, if you do the calculations, the energy estimate for that discolored forage is about 5 points higher than the one for the immature, rapidly growing forage. So this is pretty comparable with corn silage, actually. So that concept of dilution applies not only to grain fill, but also to this accumulation of water-soluble carbohydrates. Now, we did a considerable amount of grazing work over the years with these forages. Because of the way we had to do these experiments are a little hard to set up. So what I'm just going to do is go through and note a couple cautions. And the first one may seem silly, but if I plant these forages sometime in August, when do I start to graze them? Now, if you were in Oklahoma, they would tell you, well, you want to start to graze when the livestock can't pull the plant out of the ground, basically. It's a little complicated here for a number of reasons. Number one, if you start too soon, remembering that there's no regrowth potential, the cattle can walk right through this in a very short order, which may be fine with you depending on your situation, but it might not be. So that can be one issue. The other issue is, and I mentioned this before, if you start too late, you may lose a lot of available forage because of pretty significant snowfall events, which not exactly illustrated in that photograph, but when we get to December in central Wisconsin, pretty much anything could happen. So you can just lose it at that point. So when do I start becomes a complicated issue. And one season does vary from compared to the next. But basically, I think the work we did suggests that about an August or October the 1st initiation date is probably a good time to start. There's some other cautions or limitations. One is the daily allocation of forage. If you permit these cattle access to the entire pasture, when you have this high growth, they will make a huge mess out of it. So a lead wire is probably advised to improve utilization and prevent waste. The second thing is you do have to manage this residue. The top portion of this plant is probably going to be higher in quality than the bottom. So how much of this do you want to leave available or leave before you move the wire again? If you're short on forage, you may want to make them clean this up more. If you are not, then and you want to produce greater weight gains, you may move it more aggressively. The last thing I would touch on in this regard is in the north central part of the country, there is potential for mud in the fall. And in our experience, when that mud is accompanied by freezing events, this ground freezes in a very uncomfortable fashion for cattle to walk over, and they may refuse to do so. So if it becomes really wet and muddy, you may have to choose to get them off of it for a couple of days. If you want to utilize this material for silage, there are also a couple cautions. One is, as I've mentioned before, early snowstorms and low lignin can be a really bad combination. So if you have any intention of harvesting this as silage and you know there's a potential for a wet snowstorm, you may want to go out and mow this down and get it on the ground before that snow hits, or you may lose an opportunity. The second thing is, and I don't know, I wish I could say, but I don't know for sure how common this is, but when you have very high sugar concentrations in any forage and choose to make silage out of that, there's the potential for a yeast-dominated fermentation. And I did want to comment on this because of the nature of the audience. Several years ago, we did a project in Marshfield, and this was a particularly brutal winter, where we harvested Vista, the Cultivar Vista oat silage, as round bale silage at boot stage, and then again at the early heading stage of growth, and monitored the internal bale temperature as a function of time from November the 15th. And you will note that that internal bale temperature was suppressed very rapidly, and it remained below freezing and well below freezing up until about the 15th of April. And we sampled these over the winter, and you'll notice that there was essentially no fermentation whatsoever, depicted here by concentrations of lactic and acetic acid, up until the internal bale temperature reached something above freezing. And when that occurred, you got a fairly rapid fermentation. Now, that in and of itself is kind of interesting, but when you go beyond that and you look at the fermentation characteristics on the terminal sampling date, you'll notice that there are very high concentrations of ethanol in these forages, which is indicative of a yeast-dominated fermentation. That is usually accompanied by a loss of dry matter, which did in fact occur. You'll notice that in the increase in NDF, the increase in crude protein, and that's accompanied also by a depression in calculated energy content. I don't know how often this might happen. It may be an anomaly. It may be a fairly consistent thing that could happen. I don't have an answer to that, but it does occur to me that if these type of forages are to be used, you might want to use them during the dead of winter in our environment. I will also say that before they really fermented, when we sampled these forages in the dead of winter, they remained as green as they were the day we put them in the bale, which was also quite interesting and indicative of the lack of fermentation up until the middle of April. The last thing I want to touch on here is using spring wheat, barley, and comparing that with oat in the same context as we talked about with this fall oat. It occurred to me, well, if spring barley and wheat also will elongate in the fall with the same kind of a planting date, would they be similar in performance or better or worse? And we did a study, the last ones that I did in Marshfield, where we included spring barley and wheat. And in this study, we had early and late maturing cultivars of each species. And what I've plotted here is the dry matter yield for each of these for one particular year. And you'll notice that in this case, the barley out yielded the varieties of wheat and oat. And one of the reasons for this, which is very interesting actually, is that you could observe on this harvest date, which was around 9th or 10th of November, if I recall, we had a very late fall, and these plants were able to continue to grow longer than they might normally. But the barley cultivars in this particular experiment actually underwent partitioning a carbohydrate into the seed head, and we had filling seeds. And I think that contributed quite a bit to this yield advantage that you see here, because that did not occur for the wheat or the oat in this particular case. And you can see we got some pretty exceptional yields in the fall with this approach. Now, just as a comparison here, if you look at the energy content here expressed as net energy of lactation for these forages, the early variety of wheat and oat were depressed relative to the late varieties. And I think that is directly related to the maturity issue. However, you'll notice that that did not occur for the barley. And I think that's related to two factors. One, these plants did grow in the fall when it was relatively cool. I suspect their lignin concentration was not as high as it might otherwise be. But on top of that, these had the benefit of grain fill as well. And I think that provided an advantage here compared to the early varieties of wheat and oat. Okay, so to summarize this, and particularly for this last scenario, this management choice, which primarily we've discussed fall grown oat, is not for everyone, and it should be considered as a tool for your toolbox and not a recommendation. I think that's important to state up front. It may not be something you want to do, but it is an option that's available. Forage types are slow maturing and are better choices for early, such as 1st of August planting dates, at least in central Wisconsin. I can't speak to what those dates might look like in other parts of the north central United States. Grain types are preferred for later dates, principally because they mature faster. Plant growth during cool weather. Plants grow during cool weather and do not lignify normally. They may accumulate significant amounts of sugar in response to frost events. Cautions exist for harvest, mechanical or grazing during wet conditions, lodging in response to snow, and yeast-dominated fermentations of silage. It also appears that true spring cultivars that do not require vernalization of barley or wheat may perform similarly to fall-grown oat, but further work is needed for best management recommendations. And with that, I thank you for your attention and appreciate the opportunity to present this information. Thank you.